Imagine this. You're enjoying a peaceful day in your backyard with your furry friend, and suddenly, an angry neighbor storms up to you, yelling about your dog's behavior. But this isn't just any neighbor, it's Karen, the HOA president, and she's determined to make your life miserable. What happens next will leave you stunned, because this time, Karen isn't going to get away with it. Stay tuned to find out how one homeowner turns the tables on HOA Karen, and what comes next will shock you. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood where neatly manicured lawns and picket fences stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over everything it touched. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, and birds chirped happily from their perches. It was the kind of peaceful day that made everything feel perfect, even for those who were busy with the ordinary tasks of the weekend. For the Smith family, today was no different. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of cups, and the soft hum of the dishwasher running in the background. Dave Smith, a hard-working father and husband, was outside in the backyard, enjoying the simple pleasure of a sunny day with his best friend, his golden retriever, Max. Max was running around the yard, his tail wagging enthusiastically as he chased after a ball Dave had thrown for him. "Go get it, boy!" Dave cheered as Max bounded after the ball with unbridled energy, his paws kicking up small puffs of dust as he raced across the grass. The Smiths were the epitome of what most people would consider the ideal suburban family. They lived in a home with a perfect little garden and a white picket fence. Max was their beloved pet, adored by their children, and well known throughout the neighborhood for being friendly and approachable. In the front yard, Dave's wife, Rachel Smith, was busy hanging up a few holiday decorations for the upcoming season. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a couple of festive flags, some twinkling fairy lights, and a small inflatable pumpkin to set the mood for the season. Their kids, Ella and Ben, ran around excitedly, helping out by hanging streamers and adding small touches to the front porch. The neighborhood, while always quiet, had a warm, welcoming atmosphere, and the Smiths had always tried to contribute to that sense of cheer and community. It was a small gesture, a way of bringing a bit of color and brightness to their lives. Nothing too bold, nothing too flashy, just a bit of fun, a symbol of the family's love for each other and the joy they found in life's simplest pleasures. As the decorations were carefully placed and the last string of lights was hung, the Smiths stood back to admire their work. The front yard, though modest, now looked festive. The gentle breeze swayed the flags and caused the inflatable pumpkin to bob ever so slightly in the wind. "This looks great," Rachel smiled as she took a step back, hands on her hips. "The kids will love it." Dave nodded, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "It's perfect," he agreed, and Max seems to be enjoying himself too. As Max trotted over, tail wagging, looking for his next opportunity to play, Dave knelt down to pet him, his hand running through the soft fur on the dog's back. Max let out a happy bark, nuzzling Dave's hand in appreciation. The scene was perfect. A happy family, a playful dog, and a community that was calm, quiet, and friendly. Everything felt right in the world. However, just as the Smiths stood there, basking in the warmth of the day, the faint sound of heels clicking on the sidewalk caught their attention. Dave turned to look, his expression shifting as he recognized the approaching figure. There she was, Karen, the HOA president, infamous in the neighborhood for her obsessive dedication to enforcing every single rule in the Homeowners Association's manual. Everyone in the community knew her, the woman who would stop at nothing to make sure everyone complied with her version of order. Some people found her rules helpful, but most simply rolled their eyes at her constant policing of trivial matters. The smell of freshly mowed lawns, the noise of children playing, the colors of a friendly decoration. All of it had to meet her strict standards. Dave and Rachel exchanged a quick look. They both knew what was coming. "Karen," Dave muttered under his breath, standing up and brushing his hands off on his pants. He had hoped that, for once, she would mind her own business and leave them to their peaceful weekend. "Karen's coming over. I bet she's going to complain about the decorations." Rachel sighed, a bit of frustration creeping into her voice. Sure enough, Karen was walking directly toward the Smith's house, clipboard in hand, her sharp gaze scanning the yard as she approached. She was wearing her typical attire, a stiff blouse and slacks, perfectly pressed, as if she were about to attend a formal meeting, not just strolling through the neighborhood on a Saturday. Her expression was one of determination, and she seemed to have no intention of stopping until she had something to say. "Dave! Rachel!" Karen called out, her voice loud and authoritative, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown to conflict. Rachel forced a smile and waved politely. "Hello, Karen. How's your day going?" "Oh, don't try to make small talk," Karen snapped, ignoring the pleasantries. "I see that you've decorated your front yard." Her voice was laced with thinly veiled disdain, and her eyes immediately zeroed in on the small inflatable pumpkin. "Yes, we just thought it would be nice to add a little cheer to the neighborhood," Rachel replied, trying to keep things friendly. Karen's lips curled into a thin, almost sneering smile. "Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the HOA has very clear rules about what's allowed in the yard. These decorations," she pointed at the flags and the pumpkin, "are against the guidelines." Dave, who had been quietly observing, shook his head in disbelief. "Karen, these are just simple decorations for the holiday. They don't hurt anyone." "No, Karen interjected sharply. "The rules are the rules, Dave. You can't just put up whatever you want. There's a process for this. You can't just start making the neighborhood look like a circus." Rachel took a deep breath. She had dealt with Karen's constant overreach before, but today, something about her attitude pushed her over the edge. "Karen, these decorations are harmless," she said firmly. "We're just trying to have some fun. We're not hurting anyone." But Karen wasn't backing down. "Fun? This isn't about fun. It's about maintaining order in the neighborhood. I will be reporting this to the HOA, and I'll make sure these get taken down." The Smiths stared at her in disbelief. Max, still running around the yard, paused and gave a soft bark, sensing the tension in the air. But his innocent joy seemed to only fuel Karen's ire. "Karen, Max is harmless. He's a good dog. He's never caused any issues," Dave said, his voice now edged with frustration. Karen shot him a look that was pure disdain. "I've had complaints about your dog. I've had enough of all the noise, the chaos, the constant disruptions in the neighborhood. There's a reason I'm the HOA president, and that reason is to ensure peace, something that your dog, and now these decorations by you are disrupting." Rachel stepped forward again, shaking her head in disbelief. "We're not the problem here, Karen. You're the one causing the problem. You're the one turning something as simple as a few decorations into a major issue. All we're doing is trying to enjoy life and make our home a place of warmth and joy. There's nothing wrong with that." Karen held up her hand as if to silence her. "You're not listening, Rachel. I've been nothing but patient with you people, but this is irresponsible behavior. The rules are the rules, and you're going to have to face the consequences for your actions. I'll be reporting this to the HOA, and you can expect fines and penalties if those decorations aren't removed." The moment the words left her mouth, the air seemed to get even thicker. The chill between the Smiths and Karen was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Dave stood there, fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing. "Are you really going to do this over a few flags and lights, Karen?" Dave said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the tension in it was unmistakable. "Yes," she replied, with an icy finality. "I'm doing what's right for the community." Karen's eyes bore into Dave's, as if daring him to argue further, but Dave could feel his blood pressure rising. This wasn't just about a petty disagreement over holiday decorations anymore. This was about power, about control, and Karen was using every ounce of her influence to take away the Smiths' right to enjoy a peaceful moment in their own home. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Dave looked around at his yard, his decorations, his dog, and his family. And in that moment, he knew that Karen was more than just a neighbor. She was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the HOA system. She wasn't interested in fostering community or understanding. She was interested in keeping everything under her thumb. Rachel placed a hand on Dave's shoulder, offering him a silent comfort. They both knew the situation wasn't over. They couldn't let it slide. Not this time. "Okay, Karen. Fine," Dave said finally, his voice low but firm. "You can report us, but we're not taking the decorations down, and you're going to have to deal with that." For a moment there was silence. Karen stood there, looking at them as if sizing them up. Her lips curled into a tight, satisfied smile. "You'll regret this," she said coldly, turning on her heel. "I'll see you in front of the HOA board." With that, Karen walked off, leaving the Smiths standing there, in their yard, surrounded by their decorations, feeling a mix of frustration, defiance, and determination. The days that followed Karen's outburst were filled with a palpable sense of tension, one that hung over the neighborhood like a thick fog. What had initially been a small, albeit intense, confrontation between Dave and Karen quickly spiraled into something much bigger. The truth was, Karen's attack on the Smith family's simple decorations wasn't just about holiday cheer anymore. It became a symbolic battleground, a fight for freedom, community spirit, and against the suffocating grip of the Homeowners Association, HOA, that Karen was known for enforcing so zealously. At first, the Smiths tried to brush it off. They had always tried to stay out of neighborhood drama, and for the most part, their lives had been simple and untroubled. But Karen's actions felt like a personal attack, not just on their decorations, but on their very right to live peacefully and express themselves. They hadn't just decorated their yard, they had invited a little joy, a little color, and a sense of community into their space. It was supposed to be a fun, light-hearted act of holiday spirit, not a violation of neighborhood regulations. Max, their golden retriever, seemed to pick up on the tension too. Normally, he was a happy-go-lucky dog, always excited to see the family and greet anyone who walked by. But now, he spent more time lying near the back door, sensing the unease in the house. The children, Ella and Ben, were also confused by the events, not understanding why Karen had targeted them. They were used to seeing their dog play in the yard and having fun decorating for the holidays. Suddenly, their innocence was met with harsh criticism from someone who was supposed to represent the neighborhood's best interests. The neighborhood gossip. News of Karen's tirade spread like wildfire, not just among the Smiths' immediate neighbors, but through the entire community. It didn't take long for people to start talking, whispering about what had happened. At first, there were hushed conversations behind closed doors, some neighbors privately expressing their disbelief and frustration with Karen's overreaction. Then, as more people began to weigh in, the conversation went public. One evening, as Dave was tending to his yard, a neighbor named Karen Miller, a longtime resident and a woman who had always been quiet but well-liked, walked over with a concerned expression. "Hey, Dave," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was overhearing. "I heard about what happened with Karen. I just wanted to let you know that I think what she did was completely out of line. You and Rachel are such great neighbors, and this is just ridiculous." Dave sighed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks, Karen. We're trying to deal with it, but honestly, it's just a lot to take in. I didn't think putting up a few decorations would turn into something like this." Karen Miller nodded sympathetically. "I know. It's insane. You've been here long enough to know that Karen is always pushing her power. But you know what? You're not the only one she's upset. She's been giving people trouble for months now. I think we've all just been afraid to say anything." "What do you mean?" Dave asked, his interest piqued. "Well, she's been writing up people for the smallest things, stuff like painting fences a different color or trimming trees. It's not just the decorations. She's trying to control every little detail in this neighborhood. She's been out of control for a while, and honestly, I think she's been taking advantage of her position. You're not the only ones she's targeted. People just don't have the guts to fight back." Dave's heart sank. Karen's power seemed even more insidious than he had realized. He had always thought of her as a neighborhood busybody, but now it became clear. She was more than that. She had become a dictator in the neighborhood, and she was wielding her HOA authority to control every aspect of life. Karen Miller continued, "You're not in this alone, Dave. I know a lot of people who feel the same way, but we've been too intimidated to speak up. It's time someone stood up to her. Maybe you're the right person to lead the charge." Dave felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about a few flags or lights anymore. It was about something much larger. Karen's actions had created a rift in the community, a rift that needed to be mended. And if standing up for his rights and his dog meant pushing back against her oppressive rule, then he was ready to do it. The following days were a whirlwind of action. Dave and Rachel began talking to more neighbors, sharing their frustrations and encouraging others to speak out. Slowly but surely, the support for the Smiths began to grow. More people admitted they had been silenced by Karen's overbearing rules, but were now ready to push back. Word spread like wildfire, and soon there was talk of organizing a community meeting to address the HOA's oppressive policies. Mr. Green, a quiet, older man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, became one of the Smiths' most vocal supporters. He had long been unhappy with Karen's overreach, but had never felt like he could do anything about it. Now, he was taking action. He went around to the other houses, gathering signatures for a petition. The goal was to demand a review of the HOA bylaws and put an end to Karen's tyranny. "We've had enough of this. We want a neighborhood where we can decorate for the holidays without fear of being fined," Mr. Green told a group of neighbors as they signed the petition. Karen's influence began to wane. She had underestimated the power of community. The more she tried to enforce her rules, the more resistance she encountered. People were waking up to the fact that they had been living in fear of one woman's arbitrary decisions for far too long. The call to action. At the next HOA meeting, which had once been a formality with little room for dissent, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was packed with residents who had come to voice their support for Dave and to challenge Karen's rule. The mood was electric, with everyone eager to finally take action. As the meeting began, Karen was sitting at the front, confidently flipping through her papers, completely unaware of the change in the room. But when it was time to present the petition, Dave stood up, his voice strong, but calm. "We're not here to tear down the HOA, he said. "We're here because we believe in community, in freedom, and in the right to express ourselves, without fear of being punished for something as simple as decorating our yards. We're asking the board to review the rules and ensure that everyone, no matter how big or small, can enjoy their lives, without fear of being targeted by one individual." The room erupted into applause. For the first time, Karen found herself outnumbered. The board, realizing they couldn't ignore the growing momentum, agreed to review the rules and address the concerns raised by the residents. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived. The air was thick with anticipation. Dave, Rachel, and their neighbors knew that this meeting would be pivotal, not just for the Smiths, but for everyone who had been silently tolerating Karen's control over the community. For the first time in years, the residents of the neighborhood felt they had a real chance to make a change, to fight back against the overbearing HOA president and her suffocating grip on their lives. When Dave and Rachel arrived at the community center, the room was already buzzing with activity. People were seated in tight rows, flipping through their HOA manuals or chatting quietly with their neighbors. The atmosphere was filled with tension, but it was also infused with something else: hope. Hope that maybe, for once, they could finally stand up for themselves and make their voices heard. Dave scanned the room, his heart racing. It wasn't just the meeting itself that had him nervous. It was the idea that this confrontation would determine how the neighborhood would be shaped moving forward. Would it be a place where everyone felt free to express themselves? Or would Karen continue to dictate how people lived their lives? At the front of the room, Karen sat with her usual stern, no-nonsense expression. She was flipping through her papers, already preparing her speech. Her posture was rigid, and her eyes were sharp, scanning the room as if she were expecting a battle. She was the HOA president, after all, and in her mind, she was in control. The fact that Dave and the other residents had rallied against her power seemed to go unnoticed, or at least, Karen hoped it would be quickly dismissed. Dave felt a surge of confidence as he made his way to the front of the room. He and his neighbors had put together a compelling petition, one that addressed the HOA's overreach and called for the revision of rules that had stifled freedom in the community. More than half the neighborhood had signed it, and it was clear that the support was only growing. Today was their chance to turn the tide. The meeting began as usual: some small talk, a review of the community guidelines, and updates on ongoing projects. But it didn't take long before the conversation shifted to the main event: the petition that had been submitted, calling for a change in the HOA's rules regarding yard decorations, pets, and general conduct. The HOA board, a group of men and women who had always been passive in the face of Karen's leadership, exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that they had never been presented with a challenge like this before. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, the tension palpable. No longer was Karen the unquestioned authority. Dave, with the support of the neighborhood, was now the one setting the agenda. When the time came for Dave to speak, he stood up, his hand gripping the microphone. He wasn't nervous anymore. His mind was focused on the task at hand. "Good evening, everyone," Dave began, his voice calm and measured. "I'm here today, not just to defend my family, but to stand up for all of us, for every neighbor who has ever felt like they were walking on eggshells, afraid to express themselves or enjoy the simple joys of life. We're here to talk about something that's been ignored for far too long: the way this neighborhood has been controlled by rules that make no sense." Karen's eyes narrowed at Dave's words, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But Dave didn't let her distractions stop him. "Over the past few weeks," Dave continued, "I've learned a lot about how Karen, as the HOA president, has been enforcing these outdated rules. But it's not just about the rules themselves. It's about how we've all been living under her thumb, afraid of making a mistake, or expressing ourselves for fear of being fined or judged." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was silent, every resident hanging on his every word. "Here's the thing," Dave said, his voice growing stronger. "It's not about breaking the rules. It's about living in a community where we feel free to be ourselves, to decorate our yards, to have fun, to let our children play freely without fear of being reported. It's about creating a place where generosity and kindness are valued, not punished." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Karen seemed uncertain. Her grip on her clipboard tightened, but she couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had been the one to control this neighborhood for so long. Was this the moment she'd lose everything? Dave turned to face the board, all eyes on him. "We have a petition, signed by over half of this neighborhood, calling for the revision of these restrictive policies. We want more freedom. We want to live in a place where we don't feel like we need to constantly apologize for being ourselves." The room remained quiet, the tension building. Neighbors were nodding in agreement, some clapping quietly at Dave's words. Karen sat stiffly at the front, her expression one of frustration and confusion, unable to grasp the fact that her authority was slipping away. A man from the back of the room stood up, his voice loud and clear. "I'm with Dave. This isn't just about decorations. It's about the kind of community we want to be. We've let Karen run things for too long, and it's time for a change. If we don't stand up now, we'll keep living in a place where creativity and individuality are suffocated by rules that no one even remembers writing." A few others joined in, offering their support for the petition. The momentum was building. The board members exchanged uneasy looks, clearly unsettled by the growing number of people who were siding with Dave. The tables had turned. The residents were no longer backing down. They were standing united for their right to express themselves. Finally, it was time for Karen to speak. She stood up, her face flushed with anger and frustration, but there was no denying the unease in her posture. She cleared her throat, her voice loud and commanding, though it was clear she was shaken by the turn of events. "I am the HOA president," Karen began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I've done what was necessary to maintain order and keep this neighborhood looking nice. I've enforced these rules for years, and I won't let a few complaints change that." But the room didn't back down. Dave's supporters were unwavering. Karen's words fell flat, and the board members, realizing the tide had turned, began to whisper amongst themselves. The battle had shifted, and for the first time, Karen was not in control. The board voted, and the decision was made. The rules would be revised, and Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood was loosened. The victory was bittersweet. While it wasn't an outright defeat for Karen, it was a clear message that the residents were no longer willing to let her control their lives. The neighborhood, once fractured and divided by fear and stringent rules, had transformed before everyone's eyes. The meeting with the HOA board was a turning point, not just for Dave and the Smith family, but for the entire community. The change that began with a few simple decorations and an unnecessary confrontation had snowballed into a larger movement of resistance against Karen's overreach. It wasn't just about the holiday flags or Max, the family's dog, anymore. It was about the freedom to live as individuals in a community that didn't suffocate creativity or expression. The first days following the board's decision were filled with excitement and a deep sense of relief. The decision to revise the outdated HOA rules felt like a huge victory, not just for the Smiths, but for everyone who had been silently enduring Karen's oppressive grip on the neighborhood. The Smiths were no longer the only ones standing up against her. They had united their community, turning the tide in their favor. In the days that followed, the Smiths' front yard became something of a symbol, not just for their personal victory, but for the larger change that was happening in the neighborhood. The decorations that had once been the source of such conflict were now a visible representation of the community's resilience, their refusal to let one person dictate their lives. Dave and Rachel stood in their front yard, looking at the vibrant flags and lights that still swayed in the wind. It had been several weeks since the HOA meeting, but the victory still felt fresh. People would stop by, smiling and waving, and more neighbors were making small improvements to their homes, adding decorations, planting flowers, or simply enjoying the open expression of individuality that was now allowed. The sense of freedom was palpable in the air. "I can't believe it's finally over," Rachel said, resting her hand on Dave's shoulder as they looked out at the neighborhood. Dave smiled, looking around at the changes that had taken place. "It's not just over for us. Look around. This whole place feels different." Neighbors were no longer looking over their shoulders when they made personal choices. Freedom had returned to the community. People were smiling more. Families were talking. Children were playing outside without feeling like they were being watched or judged. The sense of solidarity was growing stronger every day. Everyone had rallied together, whether it was in defense of the Smiths' holiday decorations or their right to own pets and live without fear of constant policing. The ripple effect had reached more people than anyone expected. The simple act of putting up holiday decorations had catalyzed a neighborhood-wide transformation. The fear of being reported for trivial offenses was now gone, and people were beginning to feel connected in a way they hadn't in years. As for Karen, he woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, things were changing for her too, but in a very different way. The community's backlash had rattled her. She had spent years enforcing arbitrary rules and regulations, seeing herself as the guardian of the neighborhood's image. But now, she was isolated, no longer in control of her HOA reign, no longer the voice that commanded authority. For weeks after the HOA meeting, Karen would occasionally pass by the Smiths' house, her eyes lingering on the vibrant decorations that still adorned their front yard. She no longer had the power to take them down. She had lost that battle, and her inability to sway the community's opinion left her frustrated. Karen didn't speak much to the neighbors anymore. When she did, her tone had changed. There was an uneasiness in her voice, a recognition that her reign had ended. She had miscalculated. Karen had underestimated the power of the community and the strength that people had when they were united. Her control had slipped away, and she was left alone, clinging to her outdated vision of perfection while the world around her evolved. One evening, as Dave walked Max in the park, Karen's car drove slowly past them. She was alone. Dave could see her in the rear-view mirror, staring ahead, her face impassive. As the car drove by, she slowed down, rolling the window down slightly. "Dave?" she called, her voice cool but laced with something he couldn't quite place. Regret? Embarrassment? "I've been thinking about everything. About what happened." Dave turned, surprised by the unexpected conversation. "What do you mean, Karen?" "I've been a little hard on you all," she said, her voice softer now. "Maybe I took things too far." Dave stood there, considering her words. He had expected more of the same defiance, but instead, there was a vulnerability in Karen's tone. He could see it in her eyes now. She knew she had lost. She had been the one who tried to control everything, but in the end it was community, generosity, and kindness that had prevailed. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I do want to say I'm sorry," Karen continued, her voice wavering. "I've been too focused on rules. I guess I lost sight of what actually matters." Dave nodded, not out of honor, but understanding. "It's okay, Karen. Sometimes it's hard to see things when you're stuck in a box, but what really matters is how we treat each other. And that's the change we needed." Karen's eyes softened, and for the first time, she looked like someone who was considering a different perspective. "I know," she said quietly. I'm still figuring it out." With that, Karen drove off, but Dave's thoughts lingered. It wasn't the resolution he had expected, but it was a beginning. Karen wasn't the enemy. She was just a person who had lost her way, caught up in a false sense of control. Perhaps in the long run, she too could change, just like the neighborhood had. Months passed, and the Smiths' neighborhood flourished. The changes that had started with a few flags and lights had now rippled through the entire community, and the culture was shifting. There were no longer constant complaints about the smallest things. Neighbors visited more often, shared meals, and helped each other out in ways that had been rare before. Dave and Rachel looked at their children, Ella and Ben, running around the front yard playing with Max. They had become a living example of the new era the neighborhood was entering, a place where joy and happiness could thrive, free from fear of judgment. The community had begun to find its soul again. The victory that Dave and the Smiths had won was more than a battle over decorations. It was a victory for the neighborhood as a whole. It was a reminder that generosity, community, and humanity could transcend even the most rigid rules. What began as an act of rebellion against petty authority had blossomed into something far more powerful, a community that learned to celebrate each other instead of controlling them. As the neighborhood continued to grow and flourish, Dave realized that the real legacy of that fight wasn't about winning against Karen or any one person. It was about creating a space where people could live freely, where their personal choices didn't come under constant scrutiny, and where kindness was valued above all else. In the end, the Smiths had taught the entire neighborhood the true meaning of community. They didn't just decorate a yard, they had redecorated the whole community's values, showing that when people unite with love, generosity, and respect, they can overcome even the most rigid, divisive forces. Now, if you liked this story, give this channel a subscribe and this video a like for more interesting and inspirational stories in future. Thanks for your time. Shine bright like a diamond.